So you've heard a lot, both Jeff and Valerio talked also about Acre. So I've worked in 2 regions, and there are connections between them. But what I mainly wanted to talk about today was São Félix do Xingu, the same region where was talked about last week, is where I did my first work. And wow, it's all backwards.
I'm gonna, so it's not distracting, I'm gonna.
But I just want to talk about what that was like and how I got into it. So in 1975, I went to Brazil to do my dissertation research in Belo Horizonte, a big city in central Brazil, on urban working class families. Nothing to do with the Amazon. I had no idea about the Amazon. I got involved in the Amazon through the university, Federal University of Minas Gerais, where I had an affiliation. And they were contracted by SUDAM, the Superintendency for Development of the Amazon, to do a study of migration into the Amazon from other parts of Brazil. So the university had a demography program. There were economists and demographers, and they studied migration. So it was a logical choice for SUDAM, this government agency, but nobody had any experience in the Amazon. So they decided to invite me and a few other people to join an interdisciplinary team. And we invited in a lot of experts who knew the Amazon, and they talked to us. And we realized that we couldn't just do sort of get a database and crunch some numbers on migration, because this was all happening without the benefit. We had to have, and it was a very disorganized migration. There weren't sort of maps and lists of people, and it was very recent, so it hadn't been picked up in the census. And also there was all this conflict going on that we already knew about in general. This is 1975, was during the military dictatorship. So there was a lot of things people didn't know about. And we were very innocent. But we did know that we needed to do, we couldn't just go to the field with a massive team and try to do a big randomized survey. So we decided to take a more anthropological approach and focus on key informants. So in-depth interviews with people who knew a lot about the subject we were interested in. That's a key informant. And we decided to divide up our focus in terms of different groups defined by how they made a living, like ranchers, loggers, small farmers. You've heard about all these characters. And we sort of divided up our team. I became part of a pair that was focusing on small farmers. And then we drove around in various vehicles and tried to find people to interview. And we wrote up our, because it was an area of national security, and we heard about that guerrilla war last week. And I mentioned in a previous session that when we started interviewing people, they started talking about the war, the guerra. We had no idea what they were talking about, but some members of our team had heard, because this wasn't public yet. So we knew there was this military operation going after this small group of guerrillas, and as a result, there was a big military presence in this region. And so everywhere we went, we had to be very careful. We had to be sure to introduce ourselves to the police and the authorities everywhere we went, show our letters, who we were. And we were also asking about a lot of sensitive things. And so we had to be, we had to use codes for our informants. We would go off and do our interviews, and we would write up these mimeographed reports. And we had codes for the people we talked to, and we had codes for ourselves. So we had a stack of these. And of course, using typewriters, you know, listening to Cynthia and thinking about all the internet tools and the computerized tools. And we didn't have any of that, so we had to really improvise.
You would have recorded
we did some. We were a little concerned about that because of the sensitivity. People didn't always want to be recorded. and also because when you record, then you have to spend hours and hours transcribing. So we took notes and then wrote up reports. And then we would share them across the team and talk about them. So there was no baseline for us to look at. We were discovering all of this ourselves. And we were also, you know, there was no Xerox machine. There was no even a place where you could buy pens and papers in most of the towns. So I remember our first interview in St. Felix, we had handwritten questionnaires and we held them together with a paper with a safety pin. We each had one and we recorded the answers on different sheets. So, you know, just having to deal with very primitive conditions and really know where to stay. So we would show up with a team of 15 people. I wanted to pass, this is an album that each of us got. At the end, there's a picture of our team. And it's in front of the hotel in Marabá that we rented. So we rented an empty hotel. That's where we stayed. When we got to São Félix do Xingu, they gave us an empty hospital. There was a hospital that was empty, and that's where we lived for 2 months. So now I want the presentation.
And how many rangers, for example, you interview? I'm just curious to see how you approach them, because these days it's tricky to approach them. So Jeffrey mentioned that they can sometimes answer what you want to hear, and that's difficult.
Yeah, it was a very different time then. In those days, they were not seen as villains at all. They were the heroes. And the idea was that the Amazon should be a big cattle ranch. That was the thought.
It was easy to approach them.
Yeah, they were very happy. But we also, I mean, we talked with gunslingers who worked for the ranchers. It was like being in a Western movie. And they would have these patronage systems. The one gunslinger we talked to was basically the founder of a town, and everybody would come to him to ask for a lot, or they could build their house. For a while, he was the authority. So it was very much a frontier in that sense, like a Western. I never met him, but we spent many of our interviews began with church people. So every one of these towns had a priest, a nun, or a few church people from different Catholic denominations, many of them foreign, but not all of them. And they were supporting the people who were trying to organize, because that was, under the military, that was the only way you could be in a group, is if it was a church group. It was illegal. So they were very important. And the church had made a very clear commitment during this period of liberation theology in Latin America and an option for the poor, translated in the Amazon to support for small farmer migrants. And we discovered there was a land war going on. The terms of it were quite stark. You heard from Cynthia how this is still going on, but it's become much more complex. In those days, it was pretty straightforward. So this is the map of the region that we were looking at. Where we heard from Cynthia was this, the polygon of Brazil nuts is here. So it's really the same region. Here you see the Belém Brasilia highway that we mentioned that was built in the 60s, and the first road. This was the only paved road we saw. All of these other roads were dirt roads. And we were basically looking along this road, the PA 150, which joined Marabá to Conceição do Araguaia, both on the and in Brasilia. And these were the new roads that were opening up new areas. And in particular, right here, this place now called Xinguara, it's for Xingu and Araguaia, between the rivers. When we saw it in 1976, it was called Entroncamento, or Junction. It was just a little town where the construction crew had built its camp. Why? Because they were going to build this road, the São Félix do Xingu. So we got the idea of doing a study of São Félix do Xingu before and after that road. And so we went back. So in 1976, we went with this team that you're looking at the pictures of, did a study for Sudan, and we produced this 3-volume mimeographed report that told all these stories about the land wars, about the logging, about the gold mining. And it was so sensitive that it was never published. It became sort of this famous report that people would Xerox and hand around, but it was never published. And I couldn't find a copy of it in my office, so I don't know where it went. But we went back then with other funding, not connected to the government anymore, in 1978 to São Félix do Xingu to do a baseline survey with the idea that we'd go back after the road was finished and see how it had changed. So this region, we were studying this road. And then but what happened was, we thought of this before and after, but in fact, each little town that sprang up, because it took about 6 years for this road to be built. And along the way, people were trying to get out ahead of the road so that they could stake a claim to land and mining resources and logging resources. And so the towns just sprung up. And they had, for example, Orilandia means gold land. So that's a gold mining town. Tucumán was a private colonization program, so they were selling lots instead of giving them out free. So each one of them had a different dynamic, and we ended up following all those different themes that developed over time. So these were all that we would go back every year or two and basically talk in each little place, talk to the priest, talk to the mayor, talk to the school teacher, talk to the people who had been there the longest, talk to some of the new people, and just catch up. And over time, it became this incredible story that ended up in this book, which is dedicated to Samantha. So how do I get to the... So what I want to show you now is just a few very short clips from a movie that was made in 2012, when we finally were able to translate this book, published in 1992, into Portuguese. In 2012, 20 years later, with a different title, because the title didn't translate very well. And I just want to point out the picture of this Kayapo Indian on the Wingham Plain, which captures what for us was the biggest surprise, and that was the incredible resistance of local people. Kayapo during this period were able to increase their reserves by a huge amount because of their activism. That is something that our kind of neo-Marxist theories of domination of capital could not explain. And this is where I began to see that you really have to look at people's agency as well. And so that's why the book became about contested frontiers, this idea that it's not just a frontier mowing down the people in its path. Those people are pushing back, and unexpected things can happen. So in 2012, when the book came out in Portuguese, we took all of we didn't get any money from the book, we just got books so that we could take them to São Félix do Xingu and hand them out. And Valerio was already there, working there with the Nature Conservancy. So he set this trip up for us. And he also worked with a filmmaker to video the whole thing. So we have this video that's 25 minutes long, 26 minutes long. We're only going to look at a few clips.
You're a mix.
So I'm just going to flip through some of these. So so this was just sort of these unlikely characters that we were trying to understand their point of view and how they interacted and how they affected land conflicts. You heard Cynthia Simmons last week talking about how land conflict actually stimulates deforestation. The reason is because people need to clear land to show that they have taken control of it, just like Jeff was talking about. And so the law recognizes ownership based on deforestation. So these are the characters, the land conflicts, the miners, and these were placer mines. So in the riverbeds, they're semi-mechanized, they're not regulated. This is what's happening in Peru, big time. I think we saw some pictures. Did you show pictures? No. And this huge militarized gold mine called Cerro Pelado, which was a big mountain that was dug down to a pit. They dug down to the water table and then had to pump water out. It became very unsafe. Women were not allowed in this militarized mine, so I wasn't able to visit it, but Chuck Wood visited. It's fantastic.
That's the same mine, very sure. It's just like this big pit in the ground.
Yes.
With just tons and tons.
Yes, there were 10,000 people in that pit at one time. And it just,
documentaries about it.
yeah, it was amazing. And we were there when it was very diminished, so we didn't see it at its height. But he took these pictures. And so you can see the shift from the river taxis that we saw in São Félix do Xingu at the beginning. This was the bus, when the road was finally connected, this was the bus we rode in across the final, what's it called? Ferry, thank you. And then when I went back in 2012, there was this incredible bridge across the river. So that's that evolution. And I'm going to skip all this because we don't have time, but we kind of understood when we finished the book that people who had come looking for land were stuck because all these pieces of land had already been allocated to Indian lands or private colonization or other things. But in fact, what happened was all these informal roads, basically logging roads, began to penetrate out there. They were invisible. We didn't even know it was happening. And that was the motor for this increased deforestation and the rise in the cattle herd. So that by the time I went back in 2006 and 2012, it was the second largest cattle herd in Brazil, in this place that we thought of as a small riverside town. So that was a huge shock.
Is this driven by exports or?
It is now, but Brazil is a huge market in
It's
itself.
domestic as
So
well.
at this time, well, I'm not sure. When did they eliminate hoof and mouth disease was a problem, was a limit on export, and I'm not sure exactly when that was wiped out. And then after that, it became also very, somebody told us the other day when so this is a big protected area that was created. So São Félix is right here. It's right on the border of that. And this was created during the 2000s, partly in response to this threat of deforestation. Valeria was talking about the CAR, that's the land registry. So all of the lands that São Félix do Xingu ended up on a blacklist of municipalities with high deforestation rate, and no one in that place could get credit until they got off the blacklist, which they still have not. So they all had to become registered. This is an online registry, environmental registry, and they had to reduce deforestation. in 2005, Dorothy Stang was an American nun who was murdered, and that was part of the trigger for the creation of this big protected area mosaic that I mentioned. So we saw sort of these three different moments: the contested frontier, and then it just got worse after I went to Acre and didn't know what was going on. It got much worse. And then this effort by the government to close it down by imposing these governance shocks. And that's kind of what the article was about. So this is our team. I had to put up this picture of the Faculdade do Choc, which is
Awesome.
the beer university where we used to hang out a lot at night. Of course. And we were trying to talk to all these different groups. So you read about it in the paper, but we tried to kind of adapt Jeff Hawley's methodology to do. We had only 2 weeks in the field. We talked to a small number of people, but we tried to get a sense of how they viewed the future, the past, the evolution, and different kinds of landscapes. So we actually hand drew these forest extractivism, agroforestry, cattle raising, and asked people to say which one they preferred. We liked the hand drawings. People really enjoyed that because it gave them a chance to laugh at us. Kind of broke the ice. And then asking concepts of development. We talked about that in the paper. That linear vision that he talked about is very embedded in people's thinking. So people are very, and then some of the narratives, you can't read all this, but I'll post it if you want to look at them. People talking about their own experience on these various moves down the road, learning the limits of deforestation. Once you deforest, you lose the nutrients, and then your crops don't do well. So they were looking for ways to be more sustainable because of their own experience, not just the government. But they were all very, very optimistic. So these migrants who have really sacrificed a lot, and São Félix do Xingu seemed to them to be a really rich place in terms of resources, water, big rivers, and they really felt that if they could stick it out, they would have a good future there.